Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, I want to tell you a story. A story about faith, about loss, about hope, and about the quiet ways life sometimes reminds us that we are never truly alone. Even in our darkest moments, even when everything feels broken, there is something unseen still holding us up. This story begins in a small town where life moved slowly and quietly. The kind of place where people knew each other by name, where the sun rose over dusty roads, and where evenings were filled with the sound of crickets and distant laughter. In that town lived a man named Daniel. Daniel wasn't rich. He didn't own a big house or drive a fancy car. He worked long hours at a small repair shop fixing old machines, rusty engines, and broken tools that most people would have thrown away. His hands were always covered in grease, and his clothes carried the smell of oil and metal. But Daniel had something far more valuable than money. He had faith. Every morning before opening his shop, Daniel would sit quietly on a wooden bench outside, close his eyes, and whisper a simple prayer. Thank you for another day. It didn't matter if the day before had been hard. It didn't matter if he had made little money or faced problems. Daniel believed that every new sunrise was a gift. People in town admired him for that. They would often say, "Daniel has the strongest faith of anyone I know." And for many years, that seemed true. Life wasn't perfect for Daniel, but it was peaceful. He had a loving wife named Maria and a young son named Caleb who loved following his father around the workshop. Caleb would sit on a stool watching Daniel fix engines, asking endless questions. "Dad, how do you know which part is broken?" Daniel would smile and say, "Every machine tells a story if you listen closely." But Daniel didn't just believe machines told stories. He believed life did too. For him, every struggle had meaning. Every challenge carried a lesson. But one day, everything changed. It started with a storm. A storm so strong that it shook the entire town. Rain poured endlessly, winds tore through streets, and the river nearby began to rise higher and higher. At first, people thought it would pass. Storms came and went every year. But this one didn't stop. The river overflowed its banks, flooding homes and roads. Water rushed through the town like a wild force that no one could control. Daniel's small repair shop was one of the first places to be hit. By morning, the shop he had built with his own hands was gone. Machines destroyed. Tools scattered. Years of work washed away overnight. When Daniel saw the damage, he stood silently in the mud, staring at what remained. For the first time in many years, he didn't know what to say. Maria gently held his hand and whispered, "We'll rebuild." Daniel nodded. But deep inside, something felt different. Still, he tried to remain strong. God has a plan, he told himself. Days passed, and Daniel began searching for ways to start again. But rebuilding was harder than he imagined. Insurance didn't cover everything. Customers had moved away. Work became scarce. Money slowly disappeared. Bills began stacking up on the kitchen table. At night, Daniel sat quietly staring at them. Maria noticed the worry in his eyes. "You've always believed things would work out," she said softly. Daniel forced a smile. "They will." But doubt had quietly entered his heart. Then life struck again. One evening, Caleb became very sick. What started as a fever quickly turned serious. Doctors in the small town couldn't figure out what was wrong, so Daniel rushed him to a hospital in the city. Days turned into nights inside those cold hospital walls. Daniel sat beside Caleb's bed, holding his small hand while machines beeped softly around them. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt powerless. He prayed harder than he ever had before. "Please, don't take my son." But Caleb's condition grew worse. Daniel's faith, once strong and steady like a mountain, began to shake. He walked down empty hospital hallways late at night, whispering prayers that seemed to disappear into silence. Why is this happening? Why us? Where are you now? No answers came. And when Caleb finally recovered weeks later, Daniel should have felt relieved. But something inside him had changed. The man who once thanked God every morning now struggled to pray. He still believed, but the certainty he once had was gone. Months passed. Daniel found small jobs here and there, fixing tools, repairing old bicycles, helping neighbors. But nothing felt stable. One evening, while walking home after a long day of work, Daniel sat on a bench near the old church in town. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. Daniel stared at the ground, lost in thought. That's when he noticed someone sitting beside him. It was an old man. His clothes were simple, and his face carried the deep lines of many years. But his eyes were calm, peaceful, almost glowing with quiet understanding. The old man looked at Daniel and said, "You look tired." Daniel sighed. Life has a way of doing that. The old man chuckled softly. Yes, it does. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the old man asked, "Tell me something, do you believe in God?" Daniel hesitated. "I used to believe strongly." The old man tilted his head slightly. "And now?" Daniel took a deep breath. "Now I'm not sure if God is listening." The old man nodded slowly, as if he had heard this many times before. Something must have happened. Daniel looked at the fading sunset and began telling his story. The flood. The loss of his shop. His son's illness. The sleepless nights. The unanswered prayers. When he finished, Daniel's voice had grown quiet. "I prayed for help, but nothing changed. Everything kept getting worse. So tell me, if God is real, why does he let this happen?" The old man stayed silent for a long moment. Then he pointed toward the horizon where the last light of the sun was disappearing. "Do you see the sunset?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." The old man asked, "Is the sun gone?" Daniel frowned. "No, it's just on the other side of the world." The old man smiled. "Exactly." Daniel looked confused. The old man continued gently. "Just because you can't see the sun, doesn't mean it stopped shining." Daniel sat quietly. The old man leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes in life, darkness falls around us. Storms destroy what we built. Prayers seem unanswered. And we begin to believe we've been abandoned." He paused. But faith isn't believing only when life is easy. It's trusting that even in the darkness, the light still exists. Daniel stared at the ground. "But what about all the pain?" he asked. The old man replied softly. "Pain doesn't mean God left you. Sometimes pain is where he is working the most." Daniel shook his head. "It doesn't feel that way." The old man smiled kindly. "I know." He stood up slowly and looked at Daniel one last time. "Let me tell you something important. In the hardest moments of your life, when you thought you were walking alone, you were actually being carried." Daniel looked up, surprised. But before he could say anything, the old man had already begun walking away down the quiet street. Daniel watched him disappear into the fading evening light. That night, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. The words echoed in his mind. Just because you can't see the sun, doesn't mean it stopped shining. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. For the first time in months, he stepped outside and sat on the same wooden bench he used to pray on every morning. The sunrise slowly appeared over the town. Golden light spread across the rooftops. Daniel closed his eyes. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then quietly, almost like a whisper he wasn't sure anyone would hear, he said, "Thank you, for another day." It wasn't a long prayer. It wasn't a perfect prayer. But it was real. Days passed. Something inside Daniel began to change again. Not suddenly, not magically. But slowly. He started noticing small things he had ignored before. A neighbor bringing fresh bread. A stranger offering him a small repair job. Caleb laughing again while playing outside. Life wasn't perfect. Daniel still struggled. But he began to understand something deeper. Faith wasn't about never facing storms. Faith was about remembering that storms eventually pass. Months later, Daniel found an opportunity to rent a tiny corner space in another mechanic's garage. It wasn't much, just a few tools and a small table. But it was a beginning. Word slowly spread again. People remembered Daniel's honesty and kindness. Customers returned. Little by little, the work increased. One afternoon, while fixing an old engine, Caleb asked him the same question he had asked years ago. "Dad, how do you know which part is broken?" Daniel smiled. He looked at the machine carefully and said, "Because every machine tells a story if you listen closely." Then he paused and added something new. "And so does life." Years later, Daniel's shop became successful again. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because Daniel had learned something many people never understand. Faith isn't the absence of struggle. It's the decision to keep trusting even when everything seems uncertain. And sometimes, the moments when we feel most abandoned, are actually the moments when we are being guided the most. Because the truth is, God doesn't always calm the storm around us. Sometimes He calms the storm within us. So if you're watching this right now, and you feel like life has pushed you to your limits, if you feel like your prayers are disappearing into silence, if you feel like you're walking through darkness alone, remember this story. Remember Daniel. And remember one simple truth. Just because you cannot see the light, doesn't mean the light is gone. God never abandons you. Not in your hardest days. Not in your doubts. Not in your fears. Even when life feels silent. Even when answers don't come. Even when the road ahead looks uncertain. You are not alone. Sometimes the greatest miracles happen quietly, slowly, in ways we don't recognize until much later. So keep moving forward. Keep believing. Keep hoping. Because the same strength that carried Daniel through his storm is the same strength waiting to carry you through yours. And one day, when you look back at everything you survived, you may realize something powerful. You were never walking alone. You were being carried the whole time. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the blessings still around you today. And remember, no matter how dark the night becomes, the sun will always rise again. Sunrise.